Hello and welcome to Batflips and Nerds, the baseball podcast with a British twist. I am your host this evening, Russ and I am joined by Ben Carter. How are you doing, Ben?
I'm very good, thanks, Ross. Yeah, excited to be back on the pod after a little break. So yeah, good to talk some baseball. Pitchers and catchers reported. How exciting!
Yes, the superb owl has passed, and we are now in what can only be described as baseball season. So as those pitchers and catchers report, and we start to hear many a more story from writers having direct access to players over the next few days and weeks. Ben and I are going to go through some off-season awards and some goods, some bads, some Dan Aglers, as the Powercast boys would say. And that's what we're going to start off with a fairly simple one. The biggest off-season winner award, Ben. Who do you think are your nominations for this award?
I think to be an off-season winner, you have to do something, and that probably rules out close to half the teams in the league in terms of being active this winter, because we've seen quite a few teams sit on their hands and not necessarily do much. So for me, there were a few teams that were up for this award. I think no one could argue that a few teams in the AL East didn't put their hands up and try and do something this off-season. The Yankees, Red Sox, Blue Jays all made moves, and I like what most of those teams did, so they were all in contention for me. The AL Central, perhaps as expected, not a whole ton of moves apart from some sort of small adjustments around the edges of the roster, shall we say. In the National League, I think, again, a few teams that could be open to this award, and ultimately that's where I landed with this. I thought about the Mets. I think we'll talk about them at some point on this podcast as part of this award ceremony, as you would expect. But I went boring and I went straight bat and I went with the Dodgers. I know it's hard to give off-season winner award to the team that just went and won a World Series. You would think the only way is down, but I think when you look at the quantity and quality of players that they signed, re-signed, kept on the roster, added to the roster, versus those that they got rid of, it's hard to argue that they didn't improve. And I think when you start with a roster as strong as theirs was, and then you end the winter with an improved roster and sickening depth both in the lineup and the rotation, it's dull, but I think it's only right to say that they are one of the big off-season winners. We talked about Rocky Sasaki. He's probably the headliner guy, but there's also Blake Snell. Teoscar Hernandez re-signed as Tanner Scott. Hai-Seong Kim. Conforto, Trinan re-signed. Kershaw seemingly re-signed. The list kind of goes on. It's been another winter where the Dodgers have been dominant in the market, and they get my pick for off-season winner. So I know it's boring. I know people will boo and hiss, but they get my nod.
That's interesting. Personally, I think I probably would have gone with the Mets. I think that the changes that they've made has made more of a difference about whether they will make the playoffs and do something. I think that the Dodgers, rightly as you said, have made moves that have made that team better, which is scary, and they do sit atop most of the projections and anything out there saying that who's going to be favourites to win next season. But I think the differences in what was made in New York, I think the addition, obviously, of Juan Soto, but obviously not just with him, with bringing back kind of like Manaea, with kind of like adding in a few others that actually kind of makes it a little bit, the bring back of Alonso, adding Clay Holmes and Frankie Montes, I think really kind of fills out that squad quite well, to the point now where I would still put Atlanta favourites in that division, but I think that it's now a kind of closer to toss-up situation with them and with Philly and the Mets all being kind of fairly like in line with each other. So they've now got equally all got a tough task to kind of get to that kind of either that winning spot or to that playoff spot that they're going to be aiming for. But I imagine now that it's probably a kind of like has made the most difference from the Mets making those moves.
Yeah, you won't get any arguments from me when it comes to praising the Mets. I like what they did this offseason. I think you're right that in terms of moving the needle. Maybe they jumped to the front of the queue because the Dodgers were good before, they will be good again. And not that the Mets were bad last year, but I think, like you say, they're in a division where there's this serious competition for that division title with the Braves and the Phillies, and who knows what the Marlins and Nationals will be. And I think they definitely have put themselves in pole position to be favourites for that division with the moves that they made. Some big and splashy and others more savvy. But yeah, I think they've had a very active off-season, as most people anticipated they would do, but it's hard to argue that they haven't made their team a lot better and made themselves a real contender in that division and in the league as a whole.
Yeah, definitely. I think that the bulk probably that the Mets have added is my only tiny difference. I think LA, obviously, with the two premium pitchers that they've added in and effectively created a bullpen, which is also just as ridiculous as that starting rotation is good. But I think the not a significant amount of bat changes makes that go with there. So but I think we can stick with dual awards there. I think we don't need to argue too much about who's right or who's wrong on that side. Our next one would be a biggest off-season surprise award, and I'll go first here. And I'm going to say the Dodgers here because I was expecting them to potentially be involved with Sasaki. I was expecting them to mess around the edges with their kind of 7 to 9 spots and with their bullpen like they've done before. I was not expecting them to come out of the bat and make a huge signing with Blake Snell. The Teoscar signing is maybe something that was actually possible, but it still wasn't something I was expecting them to kind of do based on some of their track record with some of the teams. So them actually kind of not doing sometimes what people do when they win, where they stand pat or they offer big contracts to some of their top players. Well, they did that with Teoscar, who was leaving, but they've kind of continued to push when some of the other top teams in the NL and across the whole of MLB have kind of not really pushed themselves to be actually better teams.
Yeah, I find it. Yeah, I don't know. I guess it wasn't surprising to me, but and nothing the Dodgers does is surprising to me these days. They just find ways to make the team better no matter the cost. It seems. So for this, I had a couple of answers. I had one that was kind of like the most surprising move, which to me was Corbin Burns to the Diamondbacks. I think we all considered different places that made sense as landing spots for him. I'm not saying no one saw this coming, but I certainly didn't see the Diamondbacks as being a team that would be at the top of that list or even in the top 5 teams in the running for him. And it kind of felt like that news came out of the blue, right? There was a lot of rumours about where he might go and a lot of he could make a decision as early as this week. This was obviously back fairly early in free agency. And I just didn't see the Diamondbacks as a team that would be in for him, and they very much were. And that proved to be, something of a shock. And I like that move for them. I think he was clearly the top of the free agent market for starting pitchers. I think it's a huge loss for the Orioles not to have him on their team next year, given what he provided them last year. But I loved that move for the Diamondbacks, but it certainly came as a surprise. And then from a team perspective, I actually went with the Giants. I thought they were going to be very active this off-season because I felt like they had set themselves up with flexibility payroll-wise. I felt like they were in a position where they've been stuck a little bit in no man's land from a competitive standpoint for a couple of years now, which is unlike them. Obviously, Posey taking over as president of baseball operations. And I guess they did make a splash in the Willie Adames signing, but that to me in itself was a surprise. He just didn't feel like a very Giants-y signing. And I know they've had a hole at shortstop for a long time, and I think he does fill that hole well. And whilst I don't love the deal from a pure value perspective, I think he'll probably be good there. It just wasn't the player I was expecting them to go after. Same with Justin Verlander. Again, I don't hate that deal. 1 year, no such thing as a bad 1 year deal, but I just didn't really have him down as a guy the Giants would go after. And I think all the people who I kind of had them penciled in as being in the market for never really came to fruition. And again, who's to say if that proves to be right or wrong? I think the Giants have had the benefit of the doubt over the years with some of the shrewd moves that they've made. But I thought they were going to be more active in terms of quantity of moves this offseason, and I thought the big moves they made were going to be very different to the ones that they did. So I'm a little bit surprised to be sat here in February looking at their roster the way it's kind of worked out after winter.
Yeah, I think, as I said, like that, what's gone on in some of that NL division, it's very difficult to. You see that Dodgers continue to push, and you're like, well, you guys have all got to make yourself significantly better to even cope. The Padres, seemingly with what's either going on internally or with all the issues around ownership, have kind of tried to stand pat but get better. It's hard to do that. You don't have like Juan Soto to trade this year to kind of do that. The Diamondbacks, I think that signing of Burns is a significant one, and I think if we were doing signings that were surprising, I would have only put Yusei Kikuchi signing with the Angels, like almost like immediately at the start of the offseason, as the one that I was like, excuse me, what? I was just like, Kikuchi just off the back of a great season. I'm like, the Angels? Really? That was more of it just like you agreed to sign with them. And I guess that was maybe a little bit what you were saying with Corbin Burns, but there have been discussions coming out to say that he lives in Arizona or whatever. He has family in those sorts of places. So once they offered something that was high, supposedly he turned down 20, 30, 40 million more to play in other places. But I guess for some people, like once you've been offered like a couple of 100 million or whatever, it's just like doesn't really matter too much more, and you can keep the few creature comforts that you actually have.
Not wrong.
Okay, so now we'll move on to our most improved team award, or what I've like to call the Royals Award, based on last season, where they frantically switched from a close to 100 loss team to a playoff contending team. Ben, who do you have as some potentials here?
I think there are quite a lot of teams that improved over the winter. Some of the ones we talked about as sort of the off-season winners, I think they all improved over the winter. It pains me to say it, but I think the Angels improved over the winter. The Kikuchi deal, as you mentioned, they've been fairly active. They've brought in some interesting players on short and long-term deals that I like. I think anytime you talk about most improved, hey, maybe the White Sox are in contention considering how just dreadful they were last year, and the base they were starting from. Any sort of improvement would be improvement overall. But I actually went, and this may be a little bit surprising, but I actually went with the Athletics. I quite like the winter they've had. I think shockingly active by their usual standards in actually bringing in free agents. I liked the Severino deal. I liked getting a few of these guys, Urshela, Leclerc, on 1 year deals. I like the trade with the Rays, getting Jeffrey Springs. None of these are super sexy and are going to vault them into contention. But I think we were probably, or at least I was a little surprised last year with how sneaky good they were and sneaky competitive they were. And I think they've had a sneaky good winter and added guys that will help them get better without being, bank breaking or without having to give up tons of prospects. So lots of question marks still around what the hell the future holds for this franchise. But I quite like the winter they had, and I think that they've improved. If nothing else, they've added players who will be good for them, and I think they'll be again a team that goes under the radar as fairly strong in 2025.
Yes, I think obviously then adding the extension for Brent Rooker as well kind of gives them that centerpiece for who's going to be the face of that franchise.
Star,
while it has its time in Sacramento and before it, let's say, eventually heads to Los Angeles. Obviously, the slightly depressing side of it is kind of the fact that it looks like it's only occurred because they're within chance of getting a grievance from the Players Association if they don't spend a certain amount, and they've been running foul of that for as long as they possibly could before actually spending the money. So them getting out of Oakland, and now they would be like, oh look, we can spend 50 million more, or we have to spend 50 million more, does have a bitter taste in the mouth for me personally. But yes, I can see why you would think that on the way. I think for me, the team that I would go is I think the Chicago Cubs have done a lot, and I think they've done a lot in a division where doing it will make a massive impact. I think they're now probably maybe just about the favourites for that division. I don't think it's going to be particularly much like the NL Central, like the AL Central is a pretty compressed like division. I think especially with the pitching available that the Pirates have, you wouldn't surprise me if you had like three teams or probably all five teams in or around like the low 80s and high 70s because none of them are exceptional. But what with the Cubs like additions that they've done, I think they've really put themselves in a place to actually like make an effort to kind of go forward and do this. Obviously, starting off with the trade for Kyle Tucker, I think him being brought in, it was a bit weird that they then kind of took him to arbitration afterwards, which you're always a bit like, excuse me, what? But I think they've added well to kind of like the back of the bullpen, and I think they've added well to their bench, which it's not necessarily the most glamorous thing to do, but having Presley as well, now they've picked up Brazier from the Dodgers as part of that, them getting rid of Brazier because they've created too good of a bullpen. I think the Cubs now are in a really good position to take a strong run at that NL Central.
Yeah, I agree. I like what the Cubs have done. I think Tucker's a legit superstar, and yeah, contractual grievances aside, I think they've landed on a really good sort of new face of the franchise, if you will, out there, and they have other players to go around him. He's not going to be on his own in that regard out there, and Matthew Boyd, I think, is a great deal for them. A nice left-handed starter to get into the rotation. A few other guys that you mentioned who've been added either on through trade or short-term deals that make them a better team. And I think some of the other teams in that division have either had quiet or underwhelming off seasons, and like you mentioned, it's also close as it is amongst those teams. It doesn't take much for the needle to move and to make them favourites, or at least a team that can compete for that division. So no, I know maybe Cubs fans were a bit underwhelmed. I think that was the expectation they'd make a huge splash in free agency, and in the end the splash more came through trade. But I mean, they're still in the market for Bregman in theory, right? So that could still come, and that would make it a slam dunk off season for them. But I like what they've done, and I think they're in a good place heading into this season.
Yeah, definitely. I think they will stand a good chance. So our next award, I've like to call the Dipoto Award, which is for the most active without actually kind of improving. I feel I would like to put forward my Cleveland Guardians for this one. I think we have traded away Miles Shaw, Josh Naylor, Andre Jimenez, and they included also then trading away Spencer Horwitz, who was one of the players that we got for Josh Naylor, and have effectively brought in Luis Ortiz, Slade Cicerne, basically the only names that you might actually like recognize. And then from a free agent perspective, Carlos Santana and Paul Sewald, beyond obviously Bieber being kind of like brought back in, but he's going to spend a lot of time being out still through injury. So I feel that they've made three key big trades, which partly helped Toronto in their attempt to get Roki Sasaki, but didn't actually do anything. And they're kind of just in exactly the same place they were last year, which says a bit about the team that actually the depth may be okay, but it's still reliant on that bullpen, and there's a lot of the projection systems have come out. They're not showing the team to be particularly good for next season because no one else is really going to project that you will have like four starters that will be under 2.5 ERAs for 2 years in a row. Sorry, four relievers who will do that for 2 years in a row.
Yeah, it's been a somewhat shockingly active winter for the Guardians, but that probably says more about what we expect them to do most years, right? Typically not a team that like to go out and make splashes in winter. But yeah, it's hard to put your finger on any of these that like significantly move the needle for them. I don't hate what they've done, but like you say, I think they're probably quite reliant on being able to cook up more of that kind of bullpen magic that they had last year, and if there's one thing we've learned, is that is not particularly consistent year to year. So there's maybe a degree of negative regression that will come with that. But I've kind of learned over the years to give the Guardians the benefit of the doubt, and they'll probably find some starting pitcher that no one's heard of who will be a star. So I'm kind of relying on them to do that again. The team that I went with, and this might prove controversial because I know some people in our podcast particularly like the winter that this team has had, but I have not been impressed with what the Rangers have done. I just don't think they've made their team much better over the course of the winter. They've been active. They've made a lot of one-year deals. They re-signed Eovaldi to a long-term deal. I like that move. I don't think Eovaldi's a bad pitcher. Old pitcher, yes, 3 years, maybe questionable in terms of length. Certainly he's had his injuries over the years, but I think when healthy, he's still a good starter. But the Jock Peterson deal, for a guy who doesn't play in the field and can only hit right-handers, don't love him getting 2 years. And some of the other guys, Higashioka, doesn't move the needle. Any of these one-year deals, I mean, there's no such thing as a bad one-year deal, right? But not convinced any of these guys are making them much better. Jake Berger in the trade with the Marlins, I know there are certain Marlins fans who love what Berger is, but again, not sure that that's a great move from him. And there's a guy they let go that we'll get onto at some point later that I think's a loss. So yeah, and not to mention Max Scherzer, Kobe Yates. I mean, there's a bunch of guys who have been good contributors who've now left. So certainly busy, active. Maybe there's more to come from them, but I do not sit here now, honestly, thinking the Rangers are a much better team than they were last year. And we went into last year talking about how they were going to be disappointing and that the World Series win was great, but didn't necessarily mean they were going to be a superstar team last year. I don't feel any different again this year, that they're going to bounce back and suddenly be amazing unless they get lucky with health. So yeah, sorry Texas Rangers fans. We have had nice things to say about you recently, but I'm going to poo-poo it a little bit here.
Yeah, it's an interesting one because I think health is more of the question than like what this squad actually is. It's like they got reasonable seasons from both Seager and Simeon last year, but they didn't get what they were maybe wanting from Wyatt Langford and Adolis Garcia. But you're right that kind of this season is potentially down to how many innings does Jacob deGrom pitch. Like if Jacob deGrom pitches 160 innings, Texas are probably going to have a fairly good season. Like that, their entire bullpen, I think, is going to almost be different to what it was last year. Which, when you want to talk about making a lot of moves that might end up having no difference on the season, you've got it right there. Like the roster resource right now has basically their top kind of like 6 relievers all being people that they picked up by a free agency or trade. So that definitely kind of means that it's a pretty open-ended question mark there of who is actually going to go out and kind of take that opportunity and take that chance. You're probably going to be led by Chris Martin, but who knows? Like this could be a lot of smokescreen, as you say, and end up with actually nothing being the difference, and there'll be a 78-win team again this year as they were last year. I'm a little bit more optimistic, but I can see why you think this.
I think they're talented. I don't think they're a bad team, to be clear. And I think they were very unlucky last year, and there's a natural, assuming that some of their guys come back healthier for longer this year, and guys like Langford improve, and some of the bullpen arms they acquire do better than their arms did last year. Like there's kind of a natural improvement that will come. I just think, considering how poorly last year went and how kind of busy the winter's been for them, I don't sit here looking at their roster versus how it ended last year thinking like, wow, they really toured up. But maybe in their mind they didn't have to, right? They just thought, get everyone healthy, hope for better luck, see if a few new bullpen arms can turn around our fortunes and do it all over again. I mean, they won a World Series with a not dissimilar roster 2 years ago, so maybe they know better than we do.
Yeah, maybe they do, maybe they don't. We have to position ourselves here, Ben, as we are the know-it-alls here. We are the nerds. So that kind of goes away from kind of like the team level things. We're now going to look maybe a bit more specifically at some individual deals themselves. So I've got one next called the Manly Not Hanley Ramirez Award, which is the sneakiest good move or best move for the off-season so far. Ben, do you have any suggestions?
I do, and I'm going back to the Rangers, and this is why I didn't kind of hinted at this and didn't say this guy's name. It's the guy they traded away. It's Nate Lowe, who they traded to the Washington Nationals, who I guess has never really ascended into stardom as far as baseball is concerned. He's a first baseman who has not got outstanding stats over his sort of 4 full seasons in the majors. But he's been a sort of solidly reliable contributor for that whole period when healthy. Last year he did miss some time. But they kind of gave him up for near enough nothing, a bullpen arm. Again, maybe it'll end up being a very useful bullpen arm in Garcia, who they got back from the Nationals. But I like this move from the Nationals side. I think this really works well for them. Giving up a lefty reliever, getting a first baseman who is under team control for 2 more years, who has shown a propensity to hit for power, propensity to draw walks, who is not going to kill you defensively at first base. I like this move a lot for the Nats. I think he is coming into there with a ton of upside as a guy who can be a middle of the order bat. Again, I don't think this is the kind of move that makes the Nationals suddenly an amazing team, and they didn't necessarily do a ton around this to make me think they're going to be suddenly competitors in 2025. But as far as sort of sneaky under the radar, I like that move. Trades go, I really like them picking him up and giving him a chance to be their everyday first baseman. So tip of the cap to the Nats, and again, that's kind of part of why I wasn't delighted with the Rangers offseason, is because I think they kind of let him go for near enough nothing.
Yeah, it's one of those interesting moves where it's a bit more short-term thinking from the Rangers, as they're kind of being like, well, we've got to have some of these players now. Does Lowe quite fit in to everything they have? Potentially not. So they've now been given another stronger bullpen arm to make a difference. For me, I've gone for Ha-Seong Kim. I think that the value on the deal that the Rays have, I think is really good. I was personally expecting him to pick up way more than he did. I think a lot of like the initial projections were out there that he was going to get probably a 2, 3, or maybe a 4-year deal, but he's ended up with this kind of like 2-year deal with the Rays, which could be a pillow contract, which he can kind of like choose out of, or just could stay with the Rays. But I think that he is a solid, like just above average, just slightly above average hitter, and a stellar, outstanding defensive like shortstop. And I think he's undervalued because we've got so used to this kind of mega shortstop system that we have now. I think if you throw Ha-Seong Kim like 10, even 5 years ago, before we had all of this birth of like the mega shortstops, people would be talking about him all the time because he would be a lot better than a lot of the other shortstops that are out there. But I believe he's kind of undervalued because of that. So it'll be interesting to see how he does with the Rays, what they will do and make changes with him. They're not necessarily known for doing maybe so much with their hitters as they are with their pitchers, but we'll see how he'll do there. But I can just see him being a solid kind of like 3-4 win guy as a minimum, and maybe he's got like a 5-win upside to him, which when they've just spent $29 million for 2 years, I think it's just such a good deal.
Yeah, I'm a Kim fan, and he does feel like a real Rays player, doesn't he? I guess he had his market reduced because of the injury, because the fact he's returning from shoulder surgery and they're not quite sure on when he'll be back. And I guess any time you hear the words shoulder surgery and it's about a player who has to throw a ball as a key part of his job, it probably scares people, even though actually the recovery rate from those are a lot better now than they were 20, 30 years ago. So I like the move for them, because I think, at the end of the day, if he comes back as expected fairly early in the season, has a great year, opts out, great, the Rays got a year of high production from him for not much money. If the injury lingers and it takes him longer to come back, he doesn't quite look himself, well, then they get the extra year on the back of it and he won't opt out, and then you kind of assume he'll return to something close to his old form, which, like you say, the floor was so high with him, where such an elite defender, good back to ball skills, has enough power, draws enough walks that like you're not too worried about the bat, where he's just going to be a really solid starting shortstop for you. Plus he's very fun to watch, and a guy who the Rays could use a player like him to kind of be a bit of a spark plug for them. So no, I like that move a lot for them. I wasn't shocked to see that he ended up having to take a sort of short-term deal just given the injury question marks. But it is such a raised move to kind of find someone who's clearly undervalued because of those concerns, work out a deal that kind of shields them from being on the hook for too much. And with the upside that he could end up being a real star for them either this year or the year after at not a huge amount of cost.
Yeah, I think you said it right that Kim was the injury played a difference. I also just think the lack of availability on some of the top teams, the need for a shortstop, I think that kind of also hurt him as well. We discussed it in the pod a few weeks back where we were like, well, where can he go? And you're like, well, actually probably the best spots in teams that need him are the Red Sox and the Tigers. And well, they're both already paying somebody else to not do that role, one via injury and one for not being good. So you're not really going to try and have two of them on the roster at the same time and be like, well, actually, like, you're not going to get the roster time. But yeah, we'll see. Obviously, only time will tell on these kind of contracts, but I don't think any of these kind of like short-term ones, especially these ones that kind of, we don't usually have like the 1 year deal now, but we have kind of these kind of 2 year pillow contracts where it has a player option for a second year where if you kind of bomb out, you've still managed to get yourself nearly 30 million instead of just a 1 year deal.
The age of the opt-out.
Yeah, the age of the opt-out. Our next award will be the Mason Sanders Award. I have duly named this to the rodeo name of Madison Bumgardner, if people can remember that time that we found out that a professional baseball player was potentially endangering himself. No, potentially endangering himself during his off-season and winning rodeo awards. But yes, we need to probably discuss what is the sneakily worst move of the off-season. Now, I think the concept of an overspend doesn't exist as much as it used to in Major League Baseball. I think teams are a little bit smarter about the way that they behave. They don't go for these sorts of things. Obviously, I'm not going to touch the Soto deal here because there's no way of knowing basically whether this is not sneakily bad, because it's just like it's either basically a great contract and it will go down as one of the best things that basically the New York Mets did, or will end up basically being one of the worst contracts of all time. I don't think there's anywhere probably like in the middle here. For me, I'm going to go with Tanner Scott. I don't like a 4 year deal for a reliever, and I don't like a 4 year deal for a reliever for $72 million. I get why they've done it. I get that effectively the Dodgers are in a win now mode, and basically the way to get Tanner Scott and to beat everybody else is just to offer the other year that everybody else wouldn't do. And having that conversation that me and John had with Zach Scott, and knowing that sometimes you need to pay beyond what your projection is to get the players that you want, it makes perfect sense. But I really think that come a year or two, we will be looking back at this being like, well, it depends. If the Dodgers win like the World Series and he's been crap, I don't think anybody will care. But if they don't win anything else and he's crap, I think this might be regarded as a very bad deal that was done at the time.
Yeah, I agree. A 4 year deal for a reliever is almost never a good idea. And I don't think Tanner Scott is bad by any means, but he certainly doesn't seem like a pitcher who would be immune to the usual risk that you get with a somewhat aging relief pitcher who kind of relies on stuff that is hard to rely on year to year to be dominant. He's been great recently. He's showed it for a couple of different teams. He gives them a lefty, and we know there's a premium on that. And the Dodgers don't exactly lack in money to spend, as we've seen at a number of different times. But yeah, I agree. I didn't love this deal at the time, and I do think it's one that could look worse in a year or two, especially if he goes through injuries or inconsistency and age catches up with him and all the rest of it. He wasn't the way that I was going with my answer to this question, though. I had a couple of names in mind, both of which actually are in New York City. One is Max Fried. Again, hard to call this a sort of sneaky bad move because it's 8 years at a record $218 million for a left-handed pitcher. But for similar reasons, I'm concerned. He's 30 years old, which isn't necessarily that old, but not on the younger side for a free agent pitcher. he's always been quite reliant on sort of pinpoint control and deception and sort of breaking balls versus overpowering hitters, and that always scares me a little bit, where you kind of worry that if that control eludes him a little bit, or if one of those pitches just loses a little bit of bite, he could quite quickly become fairly ineffective. So that one scares me a little bit. Again, I think he'll be good for the next couple of years. He definitely gives the Yankees what they need in terms of competing this year. And you do, just with those top of the market guys, you pay a premium, you accept the back end of the deal won't look great, and you just sort of swallow your pills, right, and accept that that might not be the way it goes. But that one concerns me a bit. And the other is on the Mets side of town, was the signing of Clay Holmes. Again, great reliever for the Yankees last year. Has proven himself to be an effective arm. I don't love that the Mets are making him a starter. I guess they have seen what teams like the Royals did with former Mets reliever Seth Lugo, and turning him into a starter again after a long stint in the bullpen, and figure they can do something similar with Clay Holmes. But I just, I'm concerned that it's not going to work with Holmes, and they've kind of committed to him a 3-year deal at a kind of starter's salary to be that guy, and I've not seen anything from him to show that he can be that guy consistently. I fear he's going to break down injury-wise or be ineffective as a starting pitcher. Like, sure, you can, at the end of the day, you can move him back to the bullpen, right? It's not a huge risk in that regard, but they're kind of paying him in a way that you would suggest that they think he's going to be a legitimate starting pitcher, and I think that's a gamble to take, especially considering the Mets have always struggled with depth in the rotation. So I didn't love that move for them, even though I think he's a good player and I think he fits with them. I just don't love the move to sign him as a starter, give him starter money, and kind of hope that he can figure it out once he gets into the rotation.
Yeah, you've kind of got two sides to like the same coin. I feel like with the max free deal, I almost felt when that happened that was the Yankees being like, we didn't get Soto, we have to do something, and to kind of make sure that, to not necessarily control the narrative or whatever, but it very much seemed that like, all right, just give him a couple of extra years or whatever. Let's get him in, get him in, so he is going to be like, we've made a good signing. I felt that's maybe why the Yankees probably offered a couple of years more. The Holmes, I feel this is just what they could do now they have Cohen in charge of the Mets. He can basically just be like, throw money at a problem, and if it works, it works. If it doesn't, it doesn't. Like, he doesn't care. Like, they're going to be spending a ludicrous amounts of money compared to some of the other teams when it comes to the luxury tax, but he doesn't care. Like, they're already at they're even still projected to be spending less on their payroll than they did last year, and if you think that includes the Juan Soto contract. So, like, Cohen doesn't care about how, like, money works. So, I think
it's just monopoly money to him.
It is. It honestly is. Like, and in some regards, it's kind of how team ownership should be. That, like, you're doing this for not necessarily altruistic reasons of making the sport and the team enjoyable for everybody, but it should be a sport and it should be about the entertainment value and not about, like, making money off it. So having owners like Cohen gives you that kind of, like, interesting side to it.
If you think about it that way, there's no such thing as a bad free agent signing, right? Just spend your money. You might as well see what you get. Who cares if it doesn't work out? It's not our money.
Yeah, and maybe that's something that, in some regards, that kind of first big birth of like sabermetrics or analytics in baseball maybe got wrong. That it really concentrated on these are bad deals, and kind of really killed that maybe just that first base market and those kind of like aging players where it's like, no, you really shouldn't be offering this amount of money to them. Like, you know what? Like, you want the player on your team, do it. Like, it might not work sometimes, but hey, you're gonna at least make most of your fans happier to start off with. They'll be moaning about it maybe 2 or 3 weeks down the line, but let's go with that. Okay, let's go for another player award. As we're talking about it, what is the best 1-year deal that's out there? I've called it the Profar Award after his having a 1-year deal of a very tiny amount of millions, and then suddenly now getting a 3-year deal from the Braves 1 year later. What are you thinking, Ben? Who's the best 1-year deal out there?
Yeah, I've already said it a couple of times on this podcast. I don't think there's such thing as a bad 1-year deal, right? If you're going to take a flyer on a guy, see what he does over the course of one season, why not? So I think there's a ton of potential candidates for this award. I've landed on 2 guys, a pitcher and a hitter. I really like the Walker Buehler deal with the Red Sox. I was concerned he was going to end up getting a lot more than 1 year, just given he looked really good again in October. Obviously, closed out the World Series, kind of looked maybe not his old self, but a version of himself that was dominant at times at the very end of the season and in the playoffs. And I thought teams might look at that and suddenly think, wow, we've got the old Walker Buehler back. Let's give him a 3, 4, 5 year deal and hope that he can figure it all out. And obviously that market didn't materialise for him, and the Red Sox were the beneficiaries. And I think at 1 year, and I think it's $21 million, that's a nice move for them. Like, you put him in the rotation, see what he can do. If he has kind of figured something out at the end of last year and turns into that sort of maybe not elite starting pitcher, but really strong middle of the rotation guy, that's a great deal for them. They obviously need the depth in the rotation, the Red Sox do. And I think considering what we thought he might go for, or what kind of offers he might getting him on a 1 year deal is great. There's no real risk in that injury wise, no real risk in that performance wise. If he turns into a star, then what a huge win. And the other player I had was Gleyber Torres to the Detroit Tigers. Again, a guy I thought would probably get a longer deal than 1 year, just given his sort of track record of being a strong sort of bat and offering glove up the middle for the Yankees. He's not exactly been out of the spotlight for the last 5 years or so, but obviously the market maybe didn't materialise for him, or he wanted to bet on himself. But 1 year, $15 million for a guy who can play good second base, has got contact skills, has at various times shown power, can draw walks, I think at this point in his career probably be a bit of a leader for a fairly young team as well. I love that move for Detroit. Again, if he ends up being rubbish, then it's not a huge detriment to them. I'm sure Tigers fans are scarred by up the middle signings after what's happened with Javi, but I like that move for them. He's still only 28 years old. If he has a great year, he can go out to the free market and find something better. But on a 1 year deal, I love the upside they've got from him. So yeah, those are my 2 1 year deals that I love the most, but there are plenty of candidates.
Yeah, I think for probably the first this evening, Gleyber Torres was on my list as well. So I think we both agreed with something, which obviously is a sign then that Torres is going to have an awful season. So sorry, Titans fans.
Sorry, Gleyber.
But but yeah, no, I generally think towards the end of the last season as well. I understand why he's got a short contract. I think the injuries, the hit and miss nature which he's had in his career, probably nobody was willing to put that pen to paper on a multi-year deal, but I really do see him having a good season and continuing on. Next one I put down is another Tigers one for my. I put Alex Cobb down. I thought he had a good little bit of his time towards the end of the season last year at Cleveland, coming back from injury. I think he pitched really well, and I was a little bit disappointed that we didn't kind of get anything for him. But then when the Tigers offered $15 million, I feel like that's just not something that the Guardians are going to do. So it's a little bit on the pricey end for a 1 year deal, but I think the same again, where I can see him having a good season, and if the Tigers are going well, then he's going to be a key part of them kind of getting to the postseason. If it isn't going well for the Tigers and they're not in contention, he could be an easy little one to flip to get something to kind of give yourself to go away. The same way with Torres is that if just for some reason things aren't quite going the Tigers' way, they can flip these people and get something back off them to help them in the future seasons. So yeah.
I take your word for it on Cobb. I didn't get a chance to watch him much last year, but I know you were obviously seeing him a bit more as a member of the Guardians. I just cannot believe he's still going. I feel like he's been around for ever. Remember him as a sort of exciting young prospect on the Rays, and it feels like that was 15 years ago. Maybe it was 15 years ago now. I know he's not exactly a spring chicken anymore, but it is cool that he, despite a lot of injuries and inconsistency, is still out there as a legit starting pitching option. Obviously a very different pitcher now than he was back when he first sort of sprung onto the scene, but I'll be rooting for him this year, let's put it that way.
Yeah, well, he made his debut in 2011, Ben, so yeah, it probably was 50 years ago that he was a prospect for the Rays. So it's really when you kind of think that, I've been actually watching like baseball for a long enough time to be like, there are people that I liked as prospects that are now like close to retiring out with like 13 years of Major League service.
God, we're getting old, Russell. This is depressing.
And on that, let's end on our final award of the what I've called the Fisher Price Award, or the Did You Even Try Award. I think here, like, I actually have to go with the Seattle Mariners because we've actually discussed that Oakland actually tried something, but for me, with a decision that looks eminently winnable, the fact that the Seattle Mariners have one free agent basically signing, or two free agent signings with Donovan Solano and Jorge Polanco, I I just so disappointed that they basically not kind of like put the effort in here and really tried to go for it, because they are probably right now still neck and neck with the Tigers and the Astros, and we know they said, what is it, 52% or whatever, that's, well, 54%, that's what the percentage of games you got to go win. So we know it's their mentality and they haven't changed from it, but it's still disappointing to see that, like, they are not involved in any of these top players to just kind of really push them a little bit further along the way.
Yeah, I agree. They're such a depressing team, aren't they? In that they sort of promise so much and they have so much talent, especially in the rotation, that you just want them to do well, and they can just never seem to get over the hump and truly compete. And yeah, nothing they've done this winter has made you think that that's going to be any different going into this season. I had two teams down for this. One of which you already mentioned is the Padres, who there are extenuating circumstances there, obviously, around why maybe they've been quieter this winter than we would have expected. But I do still think it's disappointing, considering how good they were at times last year, considering they seem to be the best rival to the Dodgers in that division, that we haven't seen them go out and be a bit more lively in the free agent market and the trade market. I know they were in the running for Sasaki and obviously just missed out, but that's been somewhat disappointing to see. But the team that really gets me for this one is the St. Louis Cardinals. What are we doing? What are we doing here? Nothing. They were obviously bad last year, and I think we maybe saw it coming a little bit because they didn't do a whole lot last winter either. And they've done absolutely nothing, seemingly, to try and reverse that trend. And this isn't exactly a team or a fan base that typically puts up with mediocrity. So I'm shocked, really, to see that they haven't gone out and made any major moves. I know that they've been trying to trade Nolan Arenado away, which has been complicated by his no-trade clause. Come back to the Rockies, Nolan. We can fit you in on days when Chris Bryant is injured. I know they've also been looking in other parts of the trade market and haven't necessarily been able to find suitors for other players that they're presumably just trying to basically get off the books at this point. But I thought they were going to do a lot more than this. I guess they're seeing it as a rebuild now, if we're being brutally honest. But they feel like a team that don't rebuild, right, and that kind of reset and find ways to get younger and to call on their famous devil magic. But I'm somewhat shocked that when other teams in that division, the Cubs in particular, have been pretty active and gone out and improved their roster, that the Cardinals have sat on their hands and done basically nothing.
Yeah, the Cardinals are a weird one. I feel like they don't, either the ownership or the front office don't know what to do with the situation they're in, because effectively until the last couple of years they've never been in it before. Like, they've always managed to be at worst a 500 team for the best part of 40 years. So they're now in an unprecedented scenario, and I don't think they know how to deal with it, and they're being hampered by some bad deals that didn't kind of see them the way through they thought they would do with Goldschmidt and Arenado seemingly just being like, yeah, I'm not going to go there. And most of the teams that he may want to go to are all just going to be like, yeah, no, we don't need you. Like, you're still a solid, like, third baseman. The discussion of him saying, like, oh, I'm willing to go to first or whatever, and I'm like, why are you... I know you're saying this to keep your options open, but, like, no team is legitimately putting you at first because your defense is one of the only good things you still have left. Your hitting is what's gone to pot, mate, not your defense.
Yeah, it's sad for me to see Nolan Arenado fade from what he once was. But yeah, it's the reality for him and for the Cardinals that his bat has not been up to scratch of late, and that competing teams don't particularly want to plug him into their lineup at this point. So we'll see. Maybe there's still time for a deal to get done on that front, or maybe he just returns and they see if he bounces back. But sad to see his decline as a once great third baseman on both sides of the ball.
Yes, I feel like I've been genuinely lucky that Michael Brantley kind of like retired semi-where near the top when he was my guy. The same way that probably like Arenado was for you, Ben. I hadn't quite had to have the fall of grace for one of my top players.
Yeah, no one wants to see it.
Okay, and that is the conclusion of today's episode. We have handed out some awards based on the off season, and it will be preseason come the next time that we will actually speak. We'll be seeing footage of players throwing in the backfields of spring training complexes, talking about being in the best shape of their life. We should get a counter going, Ben, maybe to be like the best shape of their life tracker to see how many players use that one, because it's gonna be big.
Oh, there is nothing better than the grainy photos taken through wire fences at spring training of guys arriving in the best shape of their life. This is truly the best time of the year for baseball sickos like us.
Indeed, and if you obviously want to listen to us, obviously you can do so here on all the podcast apps as you've done already, or via our YouTube channel now, where you'll be able to see mine and Ben's beautiful faces while we've had this conversation, and obviously with the chats that we've had previously with like Zach Scott and with a few Will Klein, who is going to be playing for the Seattle Mariners, which I have just panned. So obviously,
No offense, Will.
Yeah, the website is out there, backflipsandnerds.com, where there are some great articles coming out about some of the teams from a British perspective. Great piece from Tom Baker out there about Reese Hoskins, as well as some great pieces from Jake around the Mariners. I would recommend you go and read those. Otherwise, as always, you can find us at _nerds on X, our Batflips and Nerds on any of your other social media accounts. It's been lovely to chat with you, Ben. We'll be back with you shortly.